Hello and welcome to episode 15 of PECS and Politics. It's been a little while, but I'm back. I've got a little bit of time on my hands, as I think many of you do have right now. Now, I want to ask you a question. What is the worst thing ever? As in, what's the worst thing that could ever happen to you? I want you to think about that question while I introduce today's topic. So today I want to talk about morals, about morality, of our sense of right and wrong. Where do we get them from? What are the origins and the roots of our sense of morality? There are many of those across society, members of the public, people who are academics, teachers, politicians, philosophers, theologians, historians, who would argue that our morals come predominantly from religions. That if you live in a Muslim country in the Middle East or Asia or North Africa or parts of Africa or even in Europe, that your sense of morals stem from the teachings of Islam, from Sharia law. If you live in the West, in most of Europe, if you live in North America, Australasia, Latin America, then your values are predominantly stemming from Christian Judaic teachings. Indeed, in Israel, which is a secular state but a Jewish country, then they would stem, their morals would arguably stem from Judaism. Now, it's most obvious to see that there is a connection between the teachings of a religion and those of the values of the state and the morals which are imposed upon its citizens in certain theocracies or countries which have very close links with their religions, particularly some Muslim countries like Iran or Saudi Arabia, who do implement the laws of Sharia and the teachings of the Quran to dictate how they treat women, for example, or how they treat homosexuals, in the sense that they believe that they shouldn't exist, because that is what the Quran teaches them. Now, bear in mind, I've lived in the United Kingdom. I grew up there, spent most of my life there. I've also lived in Canada and Spain, and now I live in the Netherlands. These are countries where many people would say the values stem from Christianity, and to some degree Judaism. Judaism predominantly based on the Old Testament of the Christian teachings. But I would argue that most Western countries are very picky and choosy about what values they choose to take from Christianity. Yes, things like the Ten Commandments do feed into our sense of right and wrong. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain. For God's sake, who sticks to doing that? So even there, we're a little bit picky and choosy. But also bear in mind that in each of the countries I've lived, and in many countries in the West, homosexual marriage is now legal, despite it being, in the Old Testament, a sin, described as a sin indeed, punishable by death, by stoning. So we in the West are rather picky and choosy about the values that we pick and choose. Indeed, if you're a Jew and you happen to meet a Canaanite, then you are, according to one of the 613 mitzvah, or commandments of Judaism, meant to kill them, or at least give them the option to convert to Judaism. If they refuse to, then off with their heads. It's a commandment. But again, we're very choosy about which rules we take, which morals we adopt, and which we don't. There's also teachings in the Christian Bible about sacrificing your child in the name of a mythical supernatural entity in the sky. Do you think that's the right thing to do? There's Lot, who would rather give up his daughter to be gangbanged by a group of men than to be sodomized by them himself, for instance. That's a great teaching, isn't it? Consensually sodomized, or allow the men to sodomize each other. So questionable values there as well. Now, you would think that a God, an all-powerful, all-seeing, omnipotent God, would have known 1,500, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000, however many years ago, that the moral systems that he decided to impose on the planet at that moment in time wouldn't be relevant in thousands of years' time, or he would have the foresight to create a moral code that would still be applicable today. But we as human beings have decided to say no, we don't. And in fact, we've changed our own sense of morality over time. depending on how we understand humanity, how we relate to other human beings, how science develops, how we understand the human mind, our relationship with the world, with nature, with the planet, with the cosmos has changed over time, and so have our values to it. And that has nothing to do with religion. Indeed, I would argue that even babies can start to develop their own sense of moral code from a very early age. And babies at the age of 6 months, a year, 1.5, 2 months, what concept do they have of a God in the sky, or the teachings of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, or whatever religion you happen to predominantly have the luck or misfortune to be born into, or in very few cases chosen to convert to? They have no knowledge of religious teachings. But because they have a complex system of nerve endings, they understand pain. If I pinch them, if I smack them, they cry. They understand that's not a nice thing to have done to you or do to others. Sometimes you see babies doing it to other babies because they know it causes pain. But through that pain, through their bad behaviour, they think they can get what they want. Maybe a toy, maybe some food. They understand what it feels like to be hungry. They cry when they're hungry. They don't want to be hungry. Hunger's not a good thing. If they're brought up by good parents, they will form a strong and good connection with their mother, at least, and hopefully with their father, with their brothers and sisters, with other members of the family, family friends, also with pets, with animals, all before understanding that somebody invented a bearded man in the sky telling you how to live your life. They are already beginning to understand the concept of right and wrong. And so we carry on. We don't get our sense of morals from religion. Okay, to a certain degree, depending on how religious you are, it feeds into your life. But most of us get our sense of right and wrong from our own lived experience. And if you let the teachings of something doesn't even exist, most likely doesn't exist, and teachings that were given to people thousands of years ago dictate to you over your own sense of what should be right and wrong, then I would argue you're wrong. Most of us get our sense of right and wrong and morality through our own lived experience, based on the things that we know are good and the things that we know are bad, based on what I call a system called the worst thing ever. Doesn't exist, I've invented it. It could be complete nonsense, but it's what I base my sense of morality on. The worst thing ever, as in, what is the worst thing that could ever happen to me? And then realise that I don't want it to happen to me, and therefore I don't want it to happen to other people either. And so I will do what I can to try to stop it from happening to other people. Now, it's gradated. So, for example, if I leave my house and my car's stolen, that's going to hurt me mentally, emotionally. I'm going to feel upset. I'm going to feel vulnerable. I'm going to feel violated. It's inconvenient. I have to call my insurance company. I've got to call the police. I might have to miss a day of work. It might be difficult for me to even get to work. All these things that are not nice, but there are worse things. Is that the worst thing ever, having my car stolen or even stealing somebody's car? No, it's not a nice thing. It's a horrible thing, but there are worse things. So I ask myself, what is the worst possible thing that could happen to me? And I suppose, well, being murdered, I suppose. And then I think, but is that the worst thing ever? Is there anything that could possibly be worse that could happen to you, but maybe involve someone else? I think, yeah, it would be worse actually if I knew my parents were murdered. Or it would be even worse if I knew my child was murdered. And is that the worst thing ever? Could your child being murdered, is there something that could have made it even worse? I'm thinking, yeah. Knowing how they were murdered. I mean, if they were murdered quickly, relatively painlessly, then that's better than knowing that they had a slow, tortuous, painful death. Agonising death. That would be even worse. And then I asked myself, is there anything that could make it even worse? And I suppose, yeah, knowing the reason why they were murdered. Something could make it slightly better, I suppose, if I knew they were murdered because they had done something bad to the person who had murdered them. That there was some kind of justifiable reason. It's never justifiable to murder anyway, but at least I could rationalise it in my head as to why they were murdered. But if they were murdered just for their money or for something that they had, or even worse, if they were murdered for just who or what they are. Was my son murdered because he's Pakistani? Was he because he's black? Because he's got green eyes? Because he's gay? Because he's Jewish? Because he's blind? Because he's disabled in some way? That would be an awful reason to be murdered. All those things would be awful. Or was he murdered because of what he believed in? That he was standing up for something. He was fighting for the rights of somebody, for animals, trying to protect the planet, for human rights, for gay rights, whatever it might be. Was he murdered for any of those reasons? I think if I had a child who was murdered in a slow, agonizing death simply for being or believing something, that would be the worst thing that could possibly happen. And then that feeds into my morality. As I say, it's gradated, and I think that's probably the worst thing that could happen to me, because if I was murdered, I wouldn't need to know that. I wouldn't have to live with that knowledge for the rest of my life, agonizing me every single day. That would be awful. And therefore, I want to do everything I possibly can to not have that happen to me, but also through my own behaviour, through my own action, and looking at the behaviour of others, trying to influence the behaviour of others, never to let it happen to anybody else, because it's so, so awful. I don't want somebody's car to be stolen, but I can just about live with that. You know, cars can be replaced. It's just money. It's just material possessions. But killing somebody, and killing somebody in an unnecessarily torturous way for the most pathetic of reasons, just because you didn't like them, because you didn't like the way they looked, they had too much melanin, or you didn't like who they loved, or the way they chose to live their life. Their life had no impact on you. It didn't hurt you, but you didn't like them because of that. And then you think about all the other things. As I say, it's gradated. You begin to prioritize the things that matter to you most, and those are the things that you want to prevent most happening to you or to other people, not just people you love, but anybody. And then you work out what your moral values are. And that can begin to inform you in all sorts of situations. Okay, how should I respond to this? What's the possible outcome here? What's the least painful outcome? Is there any justifiable reason for me doing A or B or C or whatever it might be? So there you go, something to think about. And particularly at this time of moment where we are going through a global crisis, we're kind of realigning our sense of right and wrong, our own sense of morality and obligation to community, to other people, thinking about the lives of other people, the well-being of other people above our own selfish desires and needs in a difficult time when we're all having to deal with living in a way that we're not accustomed and used to, but for the sake of others. Or maybe you're not, and maybe you need to be thinking about that. Thank you very much for watching this 15th episode of PECS Politics. In relation to that, do make sure you stay well, stay healthy, keep exercising, keep eating well, and look after yourself, look after others, do your bit to help in the fight against this invisible enemy of COVID-19, and unless you're a frontline worker, stay at home. Talk to you soon.